Holcomb, Kansas. November 15, 1959, 7 a.m. A Sunday morning in a small farming community, where everyone knows everyone. Nancy Ewalt, a 16-year-old girl, pulls up to the Clutter family farmhouse with her father. She's supposed to go to church with her best friend, Nancy Clutter. The house is oddly quiet. The doors are locked, which is unusual for this trusting rural community where people rarely lock their doors. Nancy's father tries knocking. No answer. Something feels wrong. They find a way inside. What they discover will shatter the peace of this quiet Kansas town forever and send shockwaves across America. Herbert Clutter, 48, a respected wheat farmer and community leader. Bonnie Clutter, 45, his wife. Nancy Clutter, 16, their popular, accomplished daughter. Kenyon Clutter, 15, their son. All four found dead in their own home. Murdered execution style. Throats cut. Shotgun blasts at close range. The family hadn't just been killed, they'd been systematically executed in what appeared to be a carefully planned massacre. There were no signs of forced entry. Nothing of significant value was stolen. No clear motive, no obvious suspects. In a town of 270 people, where violent crime was virtually unheard of, 4 beloved members of the community had been slaughtered in the night, and nobody had heard a thing. The murders seemed random, senseless, impossible to understand, and that's what made them so terrifying. Welcome to the story of the Clutter family murders, the brutal killings that inspired Truman Capote's groundbreaking book and defined the true crime genre as we know it today. Over the next 10 minutes, we're going to explore what happened that November night, the 2 drifters who committed these murders for almost no reason at all, the investigation that captured them, and why this case still haunts us over 60 years later. This is the story of violence without meaning, of evil without explanation, and of how one family's murder changed how America thought about crime forever. The Clutters were the epitome of the American dream. Herbert Clutter was a self-made success story. He'd built River Valley Farm into one of the most prosperous wheat operations in western Kansas, employing up to 18 workers. He was a Kansas State University graduate, served on the Federal Farm Credit Board, appointed by President Eisenhower, and was active in the local Methodist church. He didn't drink, didn't smoke, and ran his life with discipline and integrity. Everyone in Holcomb respected Herb Clutter. He was the kind of man people looked up to, the kind of neighbor you'd want, the kind of father who provided stability and security for his family. Bonnie Clutter was known as a gentle, artistic woman, though she struggled with depression and anxiety that often kept her confined to her bedroom. Despite her illness, she was loved by the community and devoted to her family. Nancy Clutter, their daughter, was everything a small town considers perfect. She was class president, an excellent student, a talented musician, and she taught piano lessons to local children. She baked pies that won blue ribbons at the county fair. She was dating the son of a prominent local family. She had her entire future mapped out: college, marriage, a life full of promise. Kenyon was quieter than his sister, but he was bright, mechanically inclined, and well-liked. He spent his free time in the basement workshop building things and tinkering with projects. The Clutters lived in a large, well-appointed farmhouse on the outskirts of Holcomb. It wasn't ostentatious, but it was comfortable, the home of a successful family. They had 2 older daughters who had already moved out, married, and started their own lives. November 14, 1959, seemed like any other Saturday for the Clutters. Nancy spent the day teaching a neighbor girl how to make a cherry pie. Kenyon worked on a hope chest he was building for his sister as a wedding present. Herb conducted farm business. Bonnie stayed mostly in her room, as was typical for her on difficult days. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. Nothing suggested that this would be their last day alive. That evening, the family went about their normal routines. Nancy had a friend visit. Kenyon worked in the basement. Herb prepared for a Sunday church service where he was supposed to lead a discussion. Eventually, everyone went to bed. The house went dark, and sometime in the night, 2 strangers entered the Clutter home and destroyed this family forever. Now, let's talk about those 2 strangers, because understanding who they were is key to understanding why this case became so famous and so disturbing. Richard Eugene Hickok, known as Dick, was 28 years old. He was a mechanic, married with 3 children, but his marriage was falling apart. He'd been in and out of trouble with the law: bad checks, petty theft. He'd recently been released from the Kansas State Penitentiary, where he'd served time for theft. Dick was intelligent but directionless. charming but fundamentally dishonest. He had big dreams of easy money and no patience for the hard work it would take to earn it legitimately. Perry Edward Smith was 31. His life had been marked by tragedy and dysfunction from the start. His family was shattered. His mother was an alcoholic who died when he was young. His father was abusive. His siblings were troubled. Perry had spent time in orphanages and juvenile detention. He'd been in a motorcycle accident that left him with chronic pain in his legs. He was short, only about 5'4", which he was deeply insecure about. But he was also artistic, sensitive, and prone to vivid dreams that often turned violent. He'd served time with Dick in prison, and they'd become friends, or what passed for friendship between two damaged men. Here's how it all came together. While in prison, Dick had worked on a farm detail with another inmate who had once been employed by the Clutters. This inmate told Dick about the Clutter farm, about how Herb Clutter was a wealthy man who kept a safe in his house with at least $10,000 in cash. It was an offhand comment, probably exaggerated prison talk, but Dick latched onto it. When he got out, he contacted Perry, who was drifting aimlessly after his own release. Dick had a plan. They'd rob the Clutters, take the money, and head to Mexico to start a new life. It would be easy. The family lived in an isolated farmhouse. No one would expect it. They'd be rich, and they'd disappear. The problem was, the story about the safe was wrong. There was no safe. Herb Clutter didn't keep large amounts of cash in the house. He wrote checks for everything that was his methodical, organized way. But Dick and Perry didn't know this until after they'd already driven 400 miles to Holcomb, already broken into the house, already confronted the family. On the night of November 14th, Dick and Perry arrived in Holcomb around midnight. They cut the phone lines to the house and entered through an unlocked door. They found Herb Clutter and forced him to show them the safe. When he told them there was no safe, they didn't believe him. They searched the house but found almost nothing of value. The brutal truth was setting in. They'd driven all this way, planned this whole thing, and there was no payoff. They found about $40 to $50 total in the house, less than $50. At this point, according to later testimonies and confessions, there was a moment where they could have just left. The Clutters were tied up but unharmed. Dick and Perry could have taken the small amount of money and the radio they'd found and disappeared into the night. But something shifted. The situation had gone wrong, and now there were witnesses. The Clutters had seen their faces. Perry later claimed that Dick said they couldn't leave witnesses. Dick later blamed Perry for escalating things. The truth of who said what and who decided to cross the line from robbery to murder remains disputed. What's not disputed is what happened next. They brought Herb Clutter down to the basement furnace room, bound his hands and feet, placed him on a mattress box, and put tape over his mouth. Then Perry cut his throat and shot him in the head with a shotgun at close range. They went upstairs and did the same to Kenyon in his basement bedroom, bound, gagged, throat cut, shot in the face. They murdered Nancy in her bedroom, bound, gagged, shot in the side of the head. Finally, they killed Bonnie in her bedroom in the same manner. For executions. For innocent people killed for less than $50 and a pair of binoculars. The whole thing probably took less than an hour. Then Dick and Perry calmly left the house, got in their car, and drove away. They headed south, crossed into Mexico, then came back to the United States and drifted around, passing bad checks and committing petty crimes to survive. They had no grand plan, no real escape strategy. They were just two drifters running on borrowed time. Back in Holcomb, the discovery of the bodies sent the town into shock and terror. This wasn't supposed to happen here. This was a safe place, a community where people trusted each other, where doors stayed unlocked and neighbors looked out for one another. But now 4 people were dead in their own home, killed for no apparent reason. If it could happen to the Clutters, respected, liked, careful people, could happen to anyone. Fear gripped the community. People started locking their doors. They viewed strangers with suspicion. The sense of security that had defined small-town Kansas life was shattered. The Kansas Bureau of Investigation sent their top agents to lead the investigation, including lead investigator Alvin Dewey, who became personally invested in solving the case. But they had almost nothing to go on. No fingerprints of value. No witnesses. No clear motive. No physical evidence pointing to anyone specific. The crime scene suggested the killers had known the layout of the house, which pointed to someone local or someone with inside knowledge. But every lead went nowhere. The investigation was stalling, and the pressure was mounting. The break came from an unexpected source. A prisoner in the Kansas State Penitentiary named Floyd Wells, the same man who had told Dick Hickok about the Clutter's read about the murders in the newspaper. He immediately suspected Dick. Wells contacted authorities and told them about the conversations he'd had with Dick about the Clutter family and the supposed safe full of money. It was exactly the lead investigators needed. They tracked Dick to Kansas City and arrested him on December 30th, about 6 weeks after the murders. Perry was arrested shortly after in Las Vegas. Under interrogation, both men eventually confessed. The confessions were detailed and damning. They described the night of the murders, the search for money that didn't exist, the decision to eliminate witnesses, the executions. Perry seemed almost relieved to confess, as if carrying the weight of what they'd done had become unbearable. Dick was more calculating, trying to shift blame and minimize his role, but the evidence against both of them was overwhelming. The trial began in March 1960 and lasted only 8 days. The evidence was clear, the confessions were on record, and the community wanted justice. The defense argued that both men were mentally ill, that their troubled childhoods and psychological problems should be considered. Psychiatrists evaluated them and found evidence of personality disorders and psychological damage. But under Kansas law at the time, they were judged competent to stand trial and capable of understanding right from wrong. The jury deliberated for just 40 minutes before returning guilty verdicts on all 4 counts of first-degree murder. The sentence was death. Dick and Perry spent 5 years on death row at the Kansas State Penitentiary, appealing their sentences. During this time, they were interviewed extensively by author Truman Capote, who was writing a book about the case. Capote's relationship with the killers, particularly Perry Smith, became complicated and ethically murky. Capote seemed to develop genuine affection for Perry, seeing him as a victim of circumstances and a tragic figure. This perspective influenced how he portrayed the killers in his book, emphasizing their damaged backgrounds and psychological suffering. On April 14, 1965, after all appeals were exhausted, Richard Hickok and Perry Smith were executed by hanging at the Kansas State Penitentiary. They were the last 2 people hanged in Kansas before the state moved to other methods of execution. Perry reportedly faced his execution calmly, almost with relief. Dick was more visibly afraid. Both men died for killing for innocent people for less than $50. The Clutter murders might have faded into history as just another tragic crime except for one thing: Truman Capote's book. In 1966, Capote published his account of the murders and the investigation. The book was a sensation. Capote claimed he'd invented a new literary form, the non-fiction novel. True crime story told with the techniques of fiction, with detailed scenes, character development, and narrative structure. The book was meticulously researched. Capote spent years interviewing everyone involved: investigators, townspeople, the killers themselves. He reconstructed conversations and interior thoughts, blurring the line between journalism and literature. The book's impact was enormous. It became a bestseller, was adapted into a successful film, and essentially created the modern true crime genre as we know it. Before this book, crime reporting was straightforward journalism. After it, true crime became a literary and entertainment genre, focused not just on facts but on narrative, character, and psychological exploration. Every true crime book, documentary, and podcast that exists today owes something to Capote's approach. But the book was also controversial. Capote's portrayal of the killers, particularly Perry Smith, was sympathetic. He emphasized their difficult childhoods, their psychological damage, their humanity. Some people felt this was important, that understanding what creates killers helps us prevent future violence. Others felt it was obscene that humanizing murderers dishonored their victims. This debate continues in true crime to this day. How do we talk about killers without glorifying them? How do we explore their psychology without excusing their actions? The Clutter case also raised uncomfortable questions about randomness and meaninglessness in violence. This wasn't a crime of passion or revenge. It wasn't personal. The Clutters did nothing to provoke their murders. They were simply in the wrong place when 2 desperate men needed money. This randomness is what made the case so terrifying. It suggested that violence could strike anyone, anywhere, for no reason at all. It challenged the comforting belief that if you live right, work hard, and treat people well, you'll be safe. The Clutters did everything right, and it didn't matter. The case also exposed class and economic anxieties. Dick and Perry represented the dark side of the American dream, the people who don't make it, who fall through the cracks, who turn to violence out of desperation and resentment. The Clutters represented the successful side, the people who did everything right and achieved prosperity. The collision of these two Americas resulted in tragedy. It made people confront uncomfortable realities about inequality, mental health, and what happens to people who feel they have no legitimate path to the life they want. For the town of Holcomb, the murders left a permanent scar. The sense of innocence and safety never fully returned. The Clutter house stood empty for years because no one wanted to live in a place where such horror had occurred. Eventually, it was torn down. The town wanted to move forward, but the murders had become part of its identity. Even today, over 60 years later, Holcomb is still known primarily as the place where the Clutter family was murdered. The surviving Clutter daughters had to rebuild their lives after losing their entire immediate family in one night. They rarely spoke publicly about the murders, choosing privacy over engagement with the media circus that surrounded the case. They had to live with the knowledge that their family had been destroyed for no real reason, by strangers who had no personal connection to them. That kind of loss and trauma doesn't heal. It just becomes something you carry. The legacy of the Clutter murders extends beyond the immediate tragedy. The case influenced how police investigate violent crimes, particularly in rural areas that lacked experience with such cases. It showed the importance of following even seemingly insignificant leads. The tip from Floyd Wells was what broke the case open. It demonstrated the value of detailed crime scene analysis and systematic investigation. In some ways, this case helped modernize criminal investigation techniques. The case also contributed to debates about capital punishment. Dick and Perry were executed, but did that bring justice? Did it heal the community? Did it prevent future crimes? These questions don't have simple answers, and people still disagree about them today. What's clear is that executing the killers didn't bring the Clutters back or erase what happened. It provided closure of a sort, but it didn't provide meaning or understanding.